I want to talk a little bit about scripting, but before I do, there were just a couple of things that I wanted to remind you of or talk about with regard to the terrain script tools, the terrain modification tools. If I have the terrain selected, at this point we've talked about the raise and lower terrain height and smoothing it out and applying textures, but just to the right of that, we have the place trees tool. And if I select the place trees tool, the way that we get this to work, it's very similar to painting on textures. I need to load a tree first, so I'm going to add trees. And once I come to the add tree, I need to click on this little bullet here. And once I do that, I have all the choice of all these trees. Now again, if I have more trees than you do, that's because I've downloaded this, terrain assets from Unity, additional terrain assets. And so just for the sake of the demo, I'll grab this one of these palm trees here, and I'll just double click. The bend factor has to do with the wind simulator inside Unity. I'm gonna let that default to 0. I can always change that later, and I'll hit the add button. Now when I have the tree brush selected, I want to be mindful of what my trees, what my brush settings are, and I can just click and paint in here. Now you can see I created a lot of trees. They're very large. If I undo that, you can see the trees aren't going away. So just like the texture, or excuse me, the height tools, if I hold down Shift, it'll unpaint or do the opposite of what I'd done in the first place. So I can take the tree density down. I can change the color variation. I'll take the tree height down and the tree width. And so now when I paint in, you know, I can really start to adjust the density and the height of the trees relative to the rest of the world. So I'll just continue to lower this, and I'll start to paint this in. And in some cases, you could start to paint, you may not see the trees. And so as I start to back out, if I'm way out here, you can see that I don't see any trees. And so depending on your height and what your render settings are, and how your computer is handling this information, you may not start to see the trees until you get up close. So make sure that when you're painting, you have a decent view. So this is, I'm going to try to break this up from laying it out in the grid, and I won't keep these trees here the way they are, but just for the sake of the demo, I wanted to throw a couple of them in. And of course I'll walk around and see if that's the right size and scale, and that feels pretty good. So again, if I want to add a different kind of tree, I will add tree, click on the little bullet here, and then choose the kind of tree that I want to add. So somewhere in here there's a willow tree, so maybe I'll oops, add, and of course I could plant a willow. Now obviously that was not a willow tree that I planted. That's because I got to select the tree that I want to use, and I'll click that, and I threw a whole bunch of them down, so I want to clean those up. And again, I can play with the brush size, the density, to really get the you know, a little bit more precise placement, so I can start to build out the landscape with some different elements. Now to the right of that is this paint detail, and the paint detail will do two different things. It'll either paint a billboard style texture that's simulated, and what I mean by that is that if I go to add a detail, I can either add a grass texture or a detail mesh. And the difference between the two is if I do a grass texture, and I'll just load one of these grass textures, it's giving me a lot of different options, and many of these are not appropriate for the grass, but the ones that are say grass in front of them. And if you look really closely at these assets, I'll try to zoom in here. Here's a good example, the ferns and the grass. If you look at these closely, these are cut out of basically of photographs of this kind of asset. So these are referred to as billboard graphics. And the difference is that this won't render a 3D object. It's going to render a 2D object that is projected in the direction of the camera. So in other words, if I take this grass, and I'll just load this, and I could play with these values here, but I'll just leave everything to the default. And I come back here with this grass selected, and I'll take the brush size down, take the opacity down, and I start to paint. You can see that I paint in grass. Okay. Now, if I hit the play button, and I can look over here, and I can walk up to the grass, and I should see this kind of blowing in the wind. Yep. So when I stop and look at it, that grass feels a little high. I can walk right through it, but I'm kind of in this, you know, grassy field at this point. So I can use a lot of these details to help kind of round off my island. Now you'll notice that as I zoom out, I actually don't see the grass. So there's a really quick drop off for that grass. So if I just pull my mouse out, you can see it disappearing, and that's the level of detail we're rendering. So The idea is that if this is sufficiently far enough away from the camera, for the sake of efficiency, the camera won't render that information. So if you're going to use grass, be very careful, because if I'm way out here and I'm painting, I'm saying, well, wait a second, nothing's happening. And I know I have it selected, and I know I'm going to bump my brush way up, my opacity, and I'm painting, and I can't see anything. Well, when you zoom in, you're going to have tons and tons of grass. Okay, so you got to be really careful of that. And just like everything else, if I hold down the shift key, I can unpaint that. There's other kinds of details that you can add to your environment. This is a billboard style graphic, so if you wanted to, you could actually go out, take a photograph of something, you know, like grass or something else that you want to integrate into your scene, and modify that photograph in Photoshop, drop the background out, save it as a PNG or a Photoshop document, bring it in, and Unity will support that as a material that you can paint in as a detail. Alternatively, you could model something and you can add detail mesh. And a detail mesh is a unique model. So what I'll do is I'll load a model, and it's going to give me some examples of things that I can load. And again, many of these aren't appropriate. But here's one. Here's a rock mesh. Now this rock is a 3D model that's been modeled and textured, and by using this paint detail, we can bring this rock in, but more importantly, we can kind of randomize it and paint it in as an asset. So if I start to paint, oops, I'm getting grass, so I'll shift and unpaint that, and I'll grab this rock mesh and I'll start to paint. And obviously I've got a couple of issues here with my rocks. One, they're green, okay, and I can fix that, but the brush size is way too big. The opacity or the density is way too much. Let me take this way down. I'll take the target strength down, and you can see I'm still getting tons and tons of details here. So I'll take this stuff way down, and I can start to paint in those rocks. You can see that they're randomized in terms of their shape and their size. Now they're green, and if I go to edit, and I'll just edit the one that I have selected, or I can double click on that, you can see that this render mode is set to grass, and that's fine, I mean, for this detail, but it's picking up these color details here, and if I just shift those to white, it'll use the built-in texture of that object. So later on in this class, we'll have the opportunity to, if you're savvy to 3D programs, specifically Cinema 4D, we can build our own assets and integrate those into our map. Alternatively, we can go to Window, Asset Store, and we can take a look and see what some of the assets that are provided to us through the Unity Asset Store. And again, one of the things that I want to point out is that there's a paid for and a free asset, and Unity provides a lot of really nice assets to get started. And one way to track down some of those assets is to go to top free. And if you find something you want to take a look at, and I happen to know that this train asset, it's developed by Unity Technologies, and they put out great stuff. They developed the software. And if I go and look at this asset, not only will it tell me the details about that asset, but if I click on the publisher link, it'll take me to all of the assets that company or that publisher has put out. And it just so happens that Unity provides a ton of content for free. So a lot of this won't apply to the project that we're working on, but you can see that there's this shantytown bushes. So if we want additional trees and bushes to really create some variation in our environment, we can do that. There's some gem shaders and some other things. There's building assets and bricks and water towers and some really great stuff that we could use to leverage in our island. So armed with this information and based on what we know, this might be an appropriate time to revisit our 2D map, start to think a little bit more about our story and the reason that we're on this island, and really start to develop the theme for this project. So take a look at these assets and know that they're available. And there are two ways to import geometry or assets from either a 3D modeling application or from one of these packages. One way is to identify the thing that you want to bring in, just like we do with the water or the particles or anything else. Find the thing that you want to integrate into the scene, simply click and drag and drop into the scene, and now you have that asset available. I'll get rid of the smoke that I just brought in. If that asset does not exist already inside the project, you have the ability to, you want to stay organized, but we'll create a folder, and we may call this models. And now we can incorporate our own models, or models that we find or download from the web, into our own project. And it just so happens that I have this coin FBX, which I've provided to you. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a following presentation, but this is a model that if I just click, drag, and drop into that folder, and I go to that folder, well, now I can drag and drop that asset into the equation. So now I have this coin object that I can start to use. A little bit more about that later. So make sure that you see what's available in the Unity Asset Store. It's easy to kind of go crazy and get distracted with those assets, so make sure that the content that you're using helps to support your game design, your environment design, and it may be an appropriate time to revisit that theme. I mentioned that I want to talk a little bit about scripts, and we'll do that in the next presentation rather than getting started. In this presentation, we'll start off with a clean slate and talk about some basic interactivity. But we'll do that in the next presentation.